This is a story of how I spent weeks wondering why my husband insisted we celebrate my birthday with an elaborate dinner party at our home. Now, watching him pack his suitcase just hours after announcing our marriage was over, I realized the birthday gift he'd planned all along was his grand exit. But he never expected I'd unwrap his secret double life before dessert was served. The crystal wine glass trembled slightly in my hand as I watched Ryan adjust his tie in the hallway mirror. He'd chosen his charcoal gray suit, the one I'd given him for our 10th anniversary 3 years ago, paired with the burgundy tie that brought out the warm tones in his eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After 15 years of marriage, I still found myself admiring the strong line of his jaw, the careful precision with which he handled everything in his life. "Perfect timing," he said, catching my reflection behind him. "The first guest should be arriving in about 20 minutes. I took a measured sip of the Cabernet he'd selected for the evening, a vintage from the year we met, and tried to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Something was off. It had been for weeks. "Are you sure everything's okay?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Ryan's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" The doorbell chimed before I could press further, and Ryan moved past me with practiced ease, his hand briefly touching the small of my back, a familiar gesture that tonight felt somehow hollow. "That'll be Melissa and David," he said, already halfway down the hallway. "They're always early." I watched him greet our oldest friends with enthusiastic handshakes and warm embraces. Ryan, the charming host. Ryan, the successful architect. Ryan, my husband. But lately, I'd started to wonder if those roles had become just that, roles he was playing rather than living. The dining room looked immaculate, exactly as I'd envisioned when I spent the afternoon arranging everything. Fine china gleamed under the chandelier light, name cards in perfect calligraphy marked each place setting, and arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas created an elegant backdrop for the evening. It was beautiful, and it was all wrong. "Catherine, this is stunning," Melissa gushed, pulling me into a hug that smelled of her signature Chanel perfume. "I don't know how you do it," Ryan insisted, I replied, accepting the beautifully wrapped gift she pressed into my hands. "He's been strangely adamant about having everyone here tonight." Melissa's eyebrow arched slightly. "Well, 40 is a milestone worth celebrating properly." Within the hour, our home filled with the comfortable din of familiar voices. 30 of our closest friends and family members moved through the rooms, champagne flutes in hand, conversations flowing easily among people who had known each other for years. My sister Grace arrived with her husband James. My father came with his new girlfriend, and even my former college roommate had flown in from Chicago, all at Ryan's insistence. It should have felt perfect. Instead, I felt like I was watching a meticulously choreographed play, one where everyone knew their lines except me. From across the room, I caught Ryan checking his watch for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. He was standing near the bay window, with Martin, his business partner, their heads bent together in serious conversation. When my brother-in-law Michael approached them, both men straightened abruptly, forcing smiles that looked rehearsed. "Everything okay?" I asked, materializing, at Ryan's side with a fresh glass of champagne for him. "Just shop talk," Ryan replied smoothly, accepting the glass. "Martin was filling me in on that Seattle project." Martin nodded a bit too enthusiastically. The client's being difficult about the sustainability features, typical corporate perspective, all about the bottom line. I smiled politely, though 15 years of marriage had taught me what Ryan's deflections sounded like. This was one of them. As we moved toward the dining room, I felt my phone vibrate in the pocket of my dress. Excusing myself momentarily, I stepped into the quiet of the kitchen to check the message. It was from Eleanor, Ryan's administrative assistant at the firm. "I know it's your birthday and I hate to bother you, but could you call me when you have a minute?" It's important. And Catherine, I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? I stared at the message, rereading it twice, the knot in my stomach tightening. In the 3 years Eleanor had worked for Ryan, she'd never contacted me directly. Before I could respond, Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice light but his eyes searching. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. "Fine, just checking the time. Shouldn't we be starting dinner soon?" If he noticed the slight tremor in my voice, he didn't show it. Instead, he stepped closer, adjusting an invisible strand of hair from my face. "You look beautiful tonight," he said softly. "That dress has always been my favorite." The navy blue sheath had been a splurge last year, an impulse purchase after a particularly difficult case at the law firm where I was a partner. Ryan had praised it then, too, saying the color matched the depth of my eyes. "Thank you," I replied, studying his face closely. 15 years of waking up beside someone gives you a map to their expressions, and tonight Ryan's features seemed to be arranged too carefully. "Let's get everyone seated," he suggested, guiding me back toward the dining room with that same light touch against my back. I moved through the motions of the perfect hostess, ensuring wine glasses remained filled, encouraging conversation, between guests who didn't know each other well, laughing at anecdotes I'd heard countless times before. All the while, my phone seemed to burn in my pocket, Eleanor's message repeating in my mind. "I'm so sorry." The first course was being cleared when I noticed Ryan straighten in his chair at the head of the table. He tapped his knife gently against his wine glass, the crystal chime bringing conversations to a gradual halt. "Before we continue with this wonderful meal," he began, his voice carrying that confident tone he used in client presentations, "I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight to celebrate Catherine's birthday." Affectionate murmurs rippled through the room, and I felt my sister Grace squeeze my hand briefly from her seat beside me. "Catherine has always been extraordinary," Ryan continued, his eyes meeting mine across the length of the table. "A brilliant attorney, a loyal friend, a loving daughter and sister." The compliments felt strangely formal, as if he were introducing me at an award ceremony rather than celebrating my birthday among friends. My smile remained fixed, but I felt it growing stiff, which makes what I'm about to say even more difficult, he added, his voice dropping slightly. The room fell silent. Completely, unnaturally silent. I could hear the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound normally drowned out by conversation. After much reflection and serious consideration, Ryan said, each word carefully measured, "I've decided to accept a position with an international firm based in Frankfurt. I'll be relocating to Germany next month." My wine glass froze halfway to my lips. What was he talking about? There had been no discussions about international positions, no mentions of Germany or relocating. Ryan's firm was here, established in this city for over 20 years. The silence in the room deepened, punctuated only by a few uncomfortable coughs. "Unfortunately," Ryan continued, his eyes now fixed somewhere above my head, avoiding my direct gaze, "this also means that Catherine and I will be separating. Our paths have been growing apart for some time, and this new opportunity makes it clear that we want different things in life." The wine glass slipped from my fingers, splashing red across the pristine white tablecloth like a sudden wound. I barely noticed. The room seemed to tilt slightly, faces around the table blurring at the edges as Ryan's words echoed in my ears. Separating, growing apart, different things in life. These weren't just announcements. They were carefully rehearsed lines in a script I'd never seen. A script that apparently everyone else at the table had been expecting, judging by their lack of shock. My sister's hand gripped mine tighter, her face a mask of controlled fury directed at Ryan. "I know this comes as a surprise," Ryan was saying, though it clearly wasn't a surprise to him, "but I hope you'll all support both of us through this transition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Support? He'd just announced the end of our 15-year marriage at my birthday. Dinner, in front of our closest friends and family, without a single prior conversation with me. Support was not the word that came to mind. I felt myself rising from my chair, though I had no conscious memory of deciding to stand. The room went silent again, all eyes turning toward me. I could read the expressions clearly now: pity, embarrassment, discomfort, and on a few faces, something that looked unsettlingly like prior knowledge. "How thoughtful of you," I heard myself say, my voice coming from somewhere distant, "to combine my birthday celebration with your farewell party." Ryan at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Catherine, I thought this would be better. Everyone here loves both of us." "Better?" My laugh sounded strange even to my own ears. "Better than what, Ryan? Better than a private conversation? Better than basic respect?" My phone vibrated again in my pocket. Without thinking, I pulled it out, glancing at the screen automatically. "Another message from Eleanor. He's been planning this for months. There's more you need to know. Call me." Something cold and clarifying washed over me. Months. This had been in motion for months, while I'd been reviewing legal briefs, planning weekend trips together, and discussing renovating the guest bathroom. I looked up from my phone to find Ryan, watching me intently, his expression shifting from practiced contrition to something sharper, more calculating. He'd seen the message. "If you'll excuse me," I said, carefully folding my napkin and placing it beside my plate. "I believe I need to make a phone call." I walked out of the dining room with measured steps, acutely aware of the silence behind me. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking as I passed, marking the final moments of the life I had known until exactly 7 minutes ago. As I closed the door of our home office behind me, I heard the hesitant resumption of conversation from the dining room. The show, apparently, would go on. I took a deep breath and dialed Eleanor's number, bracing myself for whatever would come next. The evening had barely begun, but already I knew that by the time dinner ended, more than just my marriage would be over. Something in Eleanor's urgent messages, in Ryan's too careful planning, in the precision of his announcement. It all pointed to something larger than a simple separation. Ryan had crafted his exit with architectural precision, but he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated the woman who'd stood beside him for 15 years. By dessert, I would uncover exactly what my husband had been hiding, and by midnight, everyone would know the truth. Ryan and I met at a charity fundraiser 16 years ago. I was a third-year associate at Winters and Mitchell Law, having just completed a grueling case that had consumed 6 months of my life. He was there representing his architectural firm, Matthews and Associates, having recently made partner after designing a series of environmentally sustainable corporate headquarters that had earned industry recognition. Our meeting wasn't the stuff of romantic comedies. No spilled drinks or witty banter across a crowded room. Instead, we found ourselves assigned to the same table, and over rubber chicken and mediocre wine, we discovered a shared appreciation for Frank Lloyd Wright, true crime podcasts, and Italian neorealist cinema. It was easy, comfortable, and by the end of the evening, it felt inevitable when he asked for my number. Our courtship progressed with the same comfortable inevitability. Weekend hikes through state parks, elaborate homemade dinners, his skill, not mine, and long conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. 6 months later, he proposed during a trip to Chicago, appropriately enough outside Wright's Roby house. I said yes without hesitation. We built our life with the same careful consideration an architect brings to a blueprint. The Victorian house, in the historic district, close enough to both our offices but with enough character to satisfy Ryan's aesthetic sensibilities. Career advancements that we celebrated together. His growing reputation in sustainable design, my partnership at the firm. We talked about children in those early years, but agreed to revisit the idea after we'd established ourselves professionally. Somehow, the right time never seemed to arrive, and eventually, the conversations about family became less frequent. Our marriage wasn't perfect. No relationship sustains itself without weathering challenges. Ryan's work required travel, sometimes weeks at a time overseeing international projects. My cases often demanded late nights and working weekends. But we managed these separations with understanding and the confidence that our foundation remained solid. At least that's what I believed until 3 months ago, when small inconsistencies began accumulating like dust in neglected corners. First came the unusual phone calls, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room, hushed, tones that didn't match Ryan's typical business discussions. When questioned, he attributed them to a sensitive new project with confidentiality restrictions. Then his travel patterns changed. For 15 years, Ryan had maintained meticulous records of his business trips, detailed itineraries left on our shared calendar, regular check-in calls, even photographs of project sites texted throughout the day. But recently, his trips had become vaguer in description and longer in duration. European client meetings replaced specific cities and project names. His normally frequent communication during travel dwindled to brief, almost formulaic messages. Noticed changes at home, too. Ryan, who had always been present even when physically exhausted, began spending evenings in his home office with the door closed. Our conversations, once flowing naturally between topics professional and personal, became increasingly superficial. Weather, scheduling logistics, surface-level updates about mutual friends. When I suggested a weekend away to reconnect, he agreed with surprising eagerness, only to cancel 3 days before our departure, citing an emergency client meeting. The disappointment I felt was tempered by a growing suspicion that something fundamental had shifted between us. Perhaps most telling was the change in his personal habits. Ryan had always been disciplined about exercise, maintaining the same routine for years. Morning runs on weekdays, longer trail runs on weekends. Suddenly, he was attending a new gym across town, his workout schedule becoming erratic and often extending well beyond his typical hour-long sessions. These individual changes might seem insignificant in isolation, easy to attribute to work stress or midlife restlessness. But collectively, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore, even as I tried to convince myself there must be reasonable explanations. 2 weeks before my birthday, I arrived home early from work, a migraine forcing me to abandon preparation for a deposition. The house was quiet, and I was heading upstairs to lie down when I heard Ryan's voice from his office. He wasn't due home for hours. "The Frankfurt details are nearly finalized," he was saying, his tone hushed but excited. "I've spoken with the realtor about the apartment near Grüneberg Park." I froze on the stairs, my migraine momentarily forgotten. Frankfurt? Apartment? There had been no mention of any Frankfurt project, let alone one significant enough to require residential arrangements. "She doesn't suspect anything," Ryan continued, followed by a pause as the person on the other end responded. "No, I think a clean break is best. Less complicated for everyone." I retreated silently down the stairs and left the house, driving aimlessly for nearly an hour as I tried to process what I'd overheard. Was Ryan planning to take a long-term assignment abroad? Why would he keep this from me? And who was he so concerned might suspect something? That evening, when he returned at his usual time, I said nothing about coming home early or overhearing his conversation. Instead, I watched him carefully as he described his day, noting how he omitted any mention of being home in the afternoon or any reference to Frankfurt. The ease with which he constructed this alternate version of his day sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my lingering migraine. The following morning, I did something I'd never done in 15 years of marriage. I checked Ryan's phone while he was showering. The password, my birthday, hadn't changed, but much else had. Entire text conversations were missing, His email showed no recent messages, despite the constant notifications I'd observed, and his call history had been meticulously cleared. Whatever was happening, Ryan was taking considerable care to leave no digital footprint. In the weeks that followed, I considered confronting him directly, but held back, partly from fear of what I might learn, and partly from a growing determination to understand the full scope of whatever was unfolding before challenging it. I began paying closer attention to his schedule, noting discrepancies between where he claimed to be and where his location app sometimes briefly revealed him to be before he apparently disabled it. When he suggested hosting my birthday dinner at our home rather than at a restaurant as we'd initially planned, insisting on inviting a larger group than I'd wanted, I agreed. Not because the idea appealed to me, but because his insistence seemed significant in ways I couldn't yet articulate. The precision with which he approached the planning, down to personally handling the invitations, rather than allowing me to manage the guest list as I normally would, only heightened my growing certainty that the evening would serve purposes beyond celebrating my 40th year. What I never anticipated was that he would choose that gathering of our closest friends and family to dismantle our life together, turning what should have been a celebration into the public announcement of our marriage's end. Eleanor answered on the first ring as if she'd been holding her phone, waiting. Catherine, she exhaled my name like she'd been rehearsing what to say. I'm so sorry to do this tonight of all nights. I closed the office door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to steady my breathing. Through the solid oak, I could hear the muffled sounds of conversation resuming in the dining room, my birthday party continuing without me. What's going on, Eleanor? I asked, my lawyer's instincts kicking in, pushing personal shock aside to gather information. You said he's been planning this for months? Since February, at least, she confirmed. That's when the calls from the Frankfurt firm started. At first, I thought it was just another international client, but then the conversations changed. They weren't discussing projects. They were negotiating employment terms. February, 4 months ago. While we were celebrating Valentine's Day at our favorite restaurant, while Ryan was giving me the sapphire earrings I was wearing at this very moment, he had already been plotting his exit. Why are you telling me this? I asked, not unkindly. Ryan's your boss. This could cost you your job. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Because it's not right, she finally said, her voice firmer now. And because there's more you should know. The Frankfurt position isn't just a job opportunity. It's an entirely new life he's been constructing. I've made copies of some documents I think you should see. What kind of documents? Emails mostly. Financial records? Property inquiries? She hesitated. And communications with someone named Claudia Brenner. Many communications. The name meant nothing to me, but the way Eleanor said it, careful, deliberate, told me it should. Who is she? According to the correspondence, she's the development director at the Frankfurt firm, but Catherine. Eleanor paused again. The emails go back 3 years, and they're not just professional. 3 years. My mind raced back, trying to place what was happening in our lives 3 years ago. Ryan had been working on the sustainable office complex in Berlin. He'd been traveling to Germany frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time. I'd been preoccupied with the Harrington class action suit, often working past midnight. We'd been like ships passing in the night that year, but I'd never questioned our foundation. Are you saying he's been having an affair? The words felt strange in my mouth, as if I were speaking a language I'd just learned. It appears that way, Eleanor confirmed gently. But there's something else that concerned me enough to reach out tonight. 2 weeks ago, Ryan instructed our financial department to prepare documentation for separate banking arrangements. He's been moving assets gradually, not everything, but significant amounts, to accounts in Germany. Accounts with both his name and hers. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. Joint accounts. This wasn't just an affair. This was a parallel. Life being constructed brick by brick, financial beam by financial beam. I made copies, Eleanor continued. I can send them to your personal email right now if you want to see for yourself. Yes, I said, moving to the computer on Ryan's desk, the irony not lost on me. Send everything. As I waited for the email to arrive, I looked around Ryan's home office with new eyes. The space had always been meticulously organized. Architectural, journals arranged by date, reference books alphabetized, even the pens in the holder aligned by height. Now I wondered what else this orderly space might be hiding. The computer chimed with an incoming message. Eleanor had sent multiple files, each neatly labeled, financial transfers, Frankfurt, property, Claudia, communications. My finger hovered over the last one, both dreading and needing to know. The first email from Claudia Brenner to Ryan was dated 3 years and 2 months ago, shortly after his first Berlin trip. Professional in tone, it thanked him for his presentation and suggested a follow-up meeting. Nothing inappropriate, nothing to raise flags. But as I scrolled through the chronological communications, the shift was unmistakable. Business discussions gave way to personal observations. Inside jokes appeared. Plans extended beyond professional necessities to include weekend excursions, cultural events, eventually holidays. The cottage in the Black Forest exceeded expectations, Ryan had written, in an email from last December. Next Christmas will be even more perfect when we don't have to worry about return flights. I can already picture us there. No more constraints, no more divided time, no more constraints. The words struck like physical blows. Last Christmas, when Ryan had claimed to be working through the holidays on an urgent project deadline, while I'd spent the time with my sister's family, missing him, defending his absence to relatives who asked pointed questions, the financial documents revealed a methodical separation of assets that had begun approximately 18 months ago. Not everything. Ryan had been careful to maintain our joint accounts and shared investments, but enough to establish a comfortable new beginning elsewhere. The property inquiries showed he'd recently put a deposit on a 2-bedroom apartment in an upscale Frankfurt neighborhood. It was all so calculated, so architectural in its precision. Ryan hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been constructing an entire parallel existence, brick by careful brick, while maintaining the facade of our marriage. A soft knock at the office door startled me. I quickly minimized the email window before calling, "Yes?" Grace, my sister, slipped inside, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Are you okay? Everyone out there is pretending this is somehow normal, and Ryan is acting like he just announced a menu change instead of blowing up your life." "Did you know?" I asked, the question escaping before I could consider its implications. Grace's eyes widened. "No? About Germany? About him leaving? God, Catherine, of course not. I would have told you immediately." She moved closer, noticing my position at Ryan's computer. "What are you doing?" "Learning that my husband has been living a double life for the past 3 years," I replied, reopening the email window and turning the screen slightly so she could see. Grace scanned the visible text, her expression morphing from confusion to shock to rage. "That calculating bastard," she whispered. 3 years? And he's been moving money too? I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. The initial shock was receding, replaced by something colder and more focused. 15 years as a litigation attorney had taught me how to process betrayal. Not personal betrayal until now, but professional deceptions from opposing counsel, from hostile witnesses, from clients who withheld crucial information. The principles remained the same. Gather evidence, identify patterns, determine motive, prepare response. "What are you going to do?" Grace asked, her hand squeezing my shoulder in support. I looked at my watch. Barely 30 minutes had passed since Ryan's announcement. Our guests were still in the dining room, probably picking at their entrees and exchanging uncomfortable glances, while Ryan maintained his performance as the reasonable husband, making a difficult but necessary life change. First, I said, forwarding Eleanor's emails to my personal account, and then carefully erasing any trace of them from Ryan's computer. I'm going to return to my birthday dinner. Grace looked at me in confusion. You can't be serious. After what he just did? After what you've just discovered? Oh, I'm entirely serious, I replied, standing and smoothing the fabric of my dress. Ryan has orchestrated this evening very carefully. He selected the audience, controlled the narrative, and timed his announcement for maximum effect and minimum accountability. I checked my reflection in the small mirror on the wall, adjusting a strand of hair that had fallen out of place. The woman looking back at me appeared remarkably composed, considering her world had just imploded. But he made one critical mistake, I continued, meeting my sister's gaze. He assumed I would react emotionally, create a scene, leave the party in tears, or retreat in humiliation. He constructed this moment to position himself as the rational one moving forward, while I become the hysterical soon-to-be ex-wife. Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes. So instead, I'm going to finish my birthday dinner, I said, moving toward the door with newfound purpose. And then I'm going to dismantle his careful construction, piece by methodical piece, before dessert is served. As we stepped back into the hallway, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times. The night was still young, and Ryan's double life was about to collapse in the very public setting he had chosen for my humiliation. When Grace and I re-entered the dining room, the conversations hushed momentarily before resuming with forced enthusiasm. Ryan was in the middle of explaining something to David and Melissa, his hands gesturing in that animated way they did when he was particularly invested in making a point. He faltered slightly when he noticed me, clearly surprised by my composed return. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying a hint of wariness. "Everything okay?" I smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. "Just a work call," I replied smoothly, retaking my seat at the table. "Some things simply can't wait, even on birthdays." Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, studying me for signs of the emotional breakdown he had clearly anticipated. Finding none, he nodded uncertainly and turned back to continue his conversation, though with noticeably less confidence than before. I signaled to Jennifer, our caterer for the evening, who had been hovering anxiously near the kitchen door. "I think we're ready for the next course," I told her, my voice warm and steady. "And perhaps we could open that special Bordeaux Ryan has been saving. It seems like an appropriate occasion given all the announcements." If Ryan was unsettled by my calm demeanor, he was positively alarmed by my reference to the 1982 Chateau Margaux he'd been reserving for a truly significant moment. The wine had been a gift from his mentor, meant to be saved for an occasion of genuine importance. "Are you sure?" he asked, unable to fully mask his dismay. "I thought we were going to save that for a special occasion," I finished for him, holding his gaze. "I can't imagine anything more special than my 40th birthday coinciding with such a significant life change, can you?" Something flickered across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or the first inkling that his carefully orchestrated evening might not proceed exactly as planned. Nevertheless, he nodded stiffly, and within minutes, Jennifer was uncorking the prized bottle while servers distributed the next course. My father, seated near the middle of the table, had been uncharacteristically quiet since Ryan's announcement. Now he cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Ryan with the intensity he usually reserved for particularly difficult board members at his company. "This Frankfurt position," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room, silencing other conversations. "It must be quite an opportunity to make such a sudden decision." Ryan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. It is, yes. The firm is at the forefront of sustainable urban development in Europe. Fascinating, I interjected, swirling the ruby liquid in my glass. Which firm is it? You've mentioned various German projects over the years, but I don't recall any specific Frankfurt connections. A muscle twitched in Ryan's jaw, a subtle tell he'd developed years ago during particularly stressful client presentations. Brenner and Koenig Architects, he replied after a beat too long. They've been expanding their international presence. Brenner, I repeated thoughtfully. Any relation to Claudia Brenner, by chance? The wine glass in Ryan's hand tilted dangerously before he corrected it. Several drops of the precious Bordeaux splashed onto the white tablecloth, tiny crimson, stains that spread slowly, like secrets seeping through careful barriers. She's the development director, he acknowledged, his voice remarkably controlled despite the color draining from his face. How did you remember that Berlin project? 3 years ago? I interrupted, addressing the table more than Ryan. Ryan mentioned a brilliant development team. The name stuck with me, I suppose. I smiled at our guests, the perfect hostess sharing an inconsequential anecdote. Martin, Ryan's business partner, was watching this exchange with increasing discomfort. His fork suspended halfway to his mouth. He and Ryan exchanged a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. Martin knew. Possibly not everything, but enough. Ryan has always spoken highly of the German architectural approach, Martin offered, clearly attempting to normalize the conversation. Their integration of sustainability and historical preservation is unparalleled. Absolutely, Ryan agreed, visibly relieved at the professional direction. The Frankfurt project represents an extraordinary opportunity to implement some of the concepts we've only theorized about here. I took a deliberate sip of the exceptional wine, savoring both its complex flavors and the moment unfolding before me. The Frankfurt project, I mused. Is that what we're calling it now? The forced conversations around the table faltered. My longtime friend Rebecca nearly choked on her wine, while my brother-in-law James suddenly became fascinated with rearranging his silverware. Catherine, Ryan said, a warning note in his voice. I'm just trying to keep up, I replied, my tone innocent, but my eyes challenging. After all, this is the first I'm hearing about a relocation to Frankfurt, or a separation, or apparently a complete life transformation that's been in the works for… how long exactly? The table fell silent. Every eye moved between Ryan and me, the tension palpable. Ryan's practiced composure wavered, his expression cycling rapidly between irritation and alarm. I don't think this is the appropriate setting for this discussion, he said finally, placing his napkin beside his plate with deliberate care. Really? I raised an eyebrow. You thought it was the appropriate setting to announce the end of our 15-year marriage without warning, but discussing the details is somehow crossing a line? Melissa, ever the peacemaker, attempted to intervene. Perhaps we should give you two some privacy. No, please stay, I said, offering her a reassuring smile. Ryan clearly wanted an audience for this moment. It seems only fair that you all get the complete picture. Ryan pushed his chair back slightly, as if preparing to stand. Catherine, you're upset, understandably so. But this isn't like you. You. Mean composed rather than hysterical? I asked, my voice level. Asking direct questions instead of creating a scene? You're right. That probably wasn't in your script for tonight. My father, who had been watching the exchange with growing understanding, set down his fork with a decisive click. I think, he said, his authoritative boardroom voice filling the uncomfortable silence, that we'd all appreciate some clarity. Ryan, if you've made these significant decisions, surely you've thought through the details carefully enough to discuss them. Ryan's gaze darted around the table, finding no allies among faces that had shifted from awkward sympathy to growing suspicion. Even Martin was now studiously examining the pattern on his dinner plate. Of course, Ryan conceded, reaching for his water glass instead of the wine. "What would you like to know, Catherine?" It was a strategic retreat, an attempt to control the narrative by positioning himself as reasonable and forthcoming. 3 years of watching him in client negotiations had made his tactics familiar to me. "Let's start with timing," I suggested, keeping my tone conversational. "When exactly did you decide our marriage was over? Was it before or after you began discussing joint property investments with Claudia Brenner?" The water glass froze halfway to his lips, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. "No?" I reached for my phone, scrolling briefly before reading. "The apartment near Gruneberg Park exceeds our requirements. The terrace overlooking. The park will be perfect for your morning coffee ritual." That email was sent 3 weeks ago. "Interesting that you maintained our coffee dates here while planning breakfast rituals elsewhere." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Ryan's careful facade cracked further, panic flashing in his eyes before he could suppress it. "How did you—" "Or perhaps we should discuss the financial transfers," I continued, my lawyer's training, allowing me to maintain composure while methodically presenting evidence. "The new accounts established 18 months ago? The property inquiries dating back to last fall?" Ryan stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but intense. "You've made your point." I set down my phone and looked up at him calmly. "Because I'm not sure what point that would be. That you've been systematically constructing a parallel life for years? That this difficult decision you presented tonight has actually been an elaborate long-term deception? Or perhaps that this performance—" I gestured to the table, the guests, the entire carefully orchestrated evening, "was designed to position you as the reasonable party while blindsiding me in front of everyone who matters to us?" The silence that followed was absolute. Ryan remained standing, his carefully cultivated image of controlled composure now completely shattered. In its place stood a man caught in a web of his own making, exposed not by emotional accusations but by the cold, hard facts of his deception. "I think," he finally said, his voice barely audible, "that we should continue this conversation privately." I smiled, setting my napkin beside my plate as I rose to meet his gaze directly. "I completely agree. I think we have several conversations to continue privately about assets, about timelines, and about exactly what constitutes legal disclosure during divorce proceedings. But first," I turned to our stunned guests, "I believe Jennifer has prepared a birthday cake. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." The birthday cake, a 3-tiered creation of vanilla and raspberry that Jennifer had prepared according to Ryan's specific instructions, arrived with appropriate fanfare. Candles flickered in the dimmed lighting, and a strained rendition of "Happy Birthday" rippled around the table as I stood with a practiced smile, the perfect image of a woman celebrating a milestone rather than navigating the collapse of her marriage. Ryan remained rigidly in place, his earlier confidence evaporated completely. The performance he had planned so meticulously had veered wildly off script, leaving him visibly unsure how to proceed. As I blew out the candles, I caught his eye deliberately and held his gaze for one long moment. No wish needed. I already had everything I required: evidence, clarity, and the element of surprise. "Shall I cut the cake?" I asked, my voice light. "Or would you like to do the honors, Ryan? You've been so involved in planning every other aspect of this evening." He declined with a tight shake of his head, and I proceeded to distribute slices with the precision of someone determined to complete a task perfectly regardless of circumstance. Our guests accepted their portions with murmured thanks, most avoiding direct eye contact with either Ryan or me. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 as the last piece was served. The evening had developed a surreal quality, a birthday celebration continuing mechanically despite the revelation of life-altering betrayal. If you'll excuse me, Ryan finally said, pushing his untouched cake aside. I need to make a few calls. No one questioned this transparent retreat. He left the dining room with the stiff gait of someone trying very hard not to appear as though they're fleeing. The moment the door closed behind him, the carefully maintained social veneer in the room cracked. Voices erupted in overlapping questions and expressions of shock. Catherine, my God. How long have you known? The absolute nerve of him to— I raised a hand, suddenly exhausted by the performance I'd been maintaining. Please, I said. I appreciate your concern, truly, but I think it's best if we conclude the evening. Grace was immediately at my side, her arm protectively around my shoulders. I'll make sure everyone gets home, she said quietly. You don't need to manage this right now. For once, I accepted help without protest. While Grace orchestrated a surprisingly orderly departure of guests, I retreated to the kitchen where Jennifer was overseeing the cleanup. Leave it, I told her, pressing a generous tip into her hand. You've been wonderful, but I'd prefer to be alone now. After the last guest had departed with awkward hugs and promises to call tomorrow, after Jennifer and her staff had quietly packed their equipment and slipped away, the house fell into an unnatural silence. I could hear Ryan moving around upstairs, dresser drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of a suitcase being placed on the bed. I found myself standing in our living room, looking at the collection of photographs that lined the mantelpiece. 15 years of shared history captured in carefully framed moments. Our wedding day, hiking in Yosemite, the Mediterranean cruise for our 10th anniversary, Ryan receiving his sustainability award, me making partner at the firm. A curated visual, narrative of a successful marriage and partnership, all fiction, or not entirely fiction perhaps, but certainly not the complete truth. How many of these smiling moments had occurred after he began his relationship with Claudia? How many trips had he taken? How many late nights at the office had he claimed while actually building his parallel life? I removed my birthday earrings, the sapphires he'd given me while already deep into his deception, and placed them on the coffee table. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, removing the beautiful facade to reveal the reality beneath. My phone buzzed, with incoming messages from concerned friends and family, but I silenced it without reading them. Whatever supportive words they offered wouldn't change the fundamental reality I now faced. The life I had believed in had been partially illusory for years, constructed with architectural precision to create the appearance of something solid while hiding structural flaws that had been there all along. When Ryan finally came downstairs, a suitcase in each hand, he found me sitting calmly in the armchair by the window, a glass of his prized Bordeaux in my hand. I've booked a hotel, he said, his voice carefully neutral. We can discuss logistics tomorrow when things are calmer. Calmer, I repeated, savoring the word along with the wine. Like the calm that allowed you to plan an exit strategy for months without a single hint of your intentions? Or the calm with which you announced our separation to our closest friends before discussing it with me? He set the suitcases down with a sigh. Catherine, I know you're angry. Angry doesn't begin to cover it, I interrupted, surprised by the evenness of my tone. Betrayed, blindsided, humiliated, those might be more accurate starting points. But none of them fully encompass learning that my husband has been systematically constructing a separate life with another woman for 3 years. Ryan's gaze dropped to the floor. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. A laugh escaped me, sharp and humorless. Which part? The affair? The secret financial arrangements? Or just getting caught before you could execute your clean getaway? He moved into the living room but remained standing, maintaining distance between us. I didn't want to hurt you. Remarkable commitment to that goal, I observed, taking another sip of wine. Nothing says consideration for your feelings quite like a public announcement of our marriage's end at my birthday dinner. His jaw tightened. I thought it would be easier with everyone there, that you'd contain your reaction. And there it was, the true reason for the elaborate birthday setup. Not a kind attempt to soften the blow among supportive friends, but a calculated move to use social pressure to control my response, to force me into dignified acceptance rather than justified outrage. "How convenient for you," I said, "though it appears your psychological architecture wasn't quite as sound as your buildings." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing in moments of stress. Now it seemed like just another performance, a practiced movement designed to evoke sympathy. "This isn't productive," he said. "We both need space to process. We can speak with the lawyers next week and work out a fair arrangement." "Fair?" I echoed, setting down my glass. "Like the fairness you've shown in gradually moving assets to accounts I don't have access to? Or the fairness of making property investments with your girlfriend using funds from our marriage?" His expression hardened. "Those are my personal earnings from the international projects. Earned while we were married, using connections and reputation built during our marriage, while I paid the majority of our household expenses so you could reinvest in the firm." I fixed him with the same steady gaze I used in depositions. "Do you really want to begin the legal disclosure process from a position of demonstrable financial deception, Ryan?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps the first recognition that his careful exit strategy had not accounted for my professional expertise in exactly this type of situation. "We'll sort through the financials. Properly," he conceded, reaching for his suitcases again. "But not tonight." As he moved toward the door, I remained seated, watching him, not with the devastation he had anticipated, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone seeing truth for the first time. "Ryan," I called as his hand touched the doorknob. He paused but didn't turn. "Did you ever actually love me? Or was I just a convenient foundation while you built what you really wanted?" The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of shared history and 3 years of calculated deception. "I did," he finally said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "In the beginning, I truly did." Then, he was gone, the door closing with a soft click that somehow felt more final than any dramatic slam could have. I remained in the armchair for hours after he left, not crying, not raging, but thinking with increasing clarity. The shock was receding, making room for something colder and more focused. The lawyer in me was already categorizing evidence, identifying legal strategies, preparing for the battles that would inevitably come. But beneath the professional armor, another process was beginning, a fundamental reassessment of everything I had believed about my marriage, my judgment, and my future. The life I had planned no longer existed. The partnership I had trusted was revealed as an elaborate construction with hidden design flaws. As dawn broke, painting the living room in pale gold light, I finally rose from the chair. The photographs on the mantel caught the morning sun, the glass reflecting momentary brilliance that obscured the images beneath. With deliberate care, I turned each one face down, covering the false narrative they represented. It was time to begin drafting a new blueprint, one designed entirely by me. The morning after my birthday, I didn't go into the office as I normally would. Instead, I called my assistant, briefed her on the urgent rescheduling of my meetings, and took my first personal day in 3 years. Not to grieve or recover, but to begin a methodical investigation into exactly what I was facing. My legal training had taught me that information was power, and I had already gained a significant advantage by learning about Ryan's deception before he realized I knew. But the emails from Eleanor, while damning, were only fragments of what I suspected was a much larger picture. I began in our home office, the space Ryan had used as his primary workspace when not at the firm. 3 years of architecture had made me familiar with his organizational habits. His digital filing system echoed his physical one, with the same precise categories and subcategories. Or at least, that's what I had always believed. The desktop. Computer yielded little as expected. Ryan was too careful to leave obvious traces. But I knew from years of legal discovery that people rarely manage to completely erase their digital footprints, especially from shared devices and accounts. Our cloud storage remained accessible to me. Ryan had apparently not considered it important enough to exclude me yet. While the folders appeared normal at first glance, deeper examination revealed inconsistencies. Projects that should have had extensive documentation contained only summary files. Time periods that should have been filled with work product showed unusual gaps. I created a timeline marking when these digital anomalies began appearing. The pattern aligned perfectly with Eleanor's information, 3 years ago, coinciding with Ryan's first Berlin trip and his initial contact with Claudia Brenner. Next, I turned to our financial records. As an attorney accustomed to following money trails in complex litigation, I approached our accounts with professional detachment rather than personal betrayal. The joint checking account showed normal patterns, mortgage payments, utilities, grocery deliveries, restaurant charges. But our investment accounts told a different story. Transfers had been made with increasing frequency over the past 18 months, always just below amounts that would trigger automatic notifications, small enough to go unnoticed individually, but cumulatively significant. I traced these transfers to a previously unknown account at a different bank, an account I could see existed but couldn't access without Ryan's authorization. By midday, I had compiled enough financial discrepancies to justify a formal forensic accounting during divorce proceedings. But money, while important, wasn't my only concern. I needed to understand the full scope of Ryan's relationship with Claudia Brenner and how deeply it might affect the professional reputation I'd spent years building. I called Eleanor, who answered immediately. "Catherine," she said, her voice cautious. "How are you holding up?" "I'm working," I replied simply. "I need more information about Brenner and Koenig Architects and Claudia's role there. Anything you can share without compromising your position." Eleanor was silent for a moment. "I've been thinking about this all night," she finally said. "I can't continue working for Ryan after what he's done. I've written my resignation letter, so I'm not concerned about compromising my position anymore." "Are you sure?" I asked. "This could affect your professional references." "Some things matter. More than references," she said firmly. "Besides, the architectural community in this city is small. Once this story gets out, I'm not sure Ryan's reference will carry much weight." She proceeded to share everything she knew. Brenner and Koenig was indeed a prestigious firm, but not nearly as large or influential as Ryan had implied. The revolutionary projects he had described were largely conceptual, with limited practical implementation. Claudia's position as development director was legitimate, but her authority had been significantly overstated in Ryan's communications. Most importantly, Eleanor revealed that Ryan had been systematically claiming sole credit for collaborative projects, building a portfolio that misrepresented his individual contributions to present himself as more accomplished than his actual work history justified. "I've made copies of the original project files," Eleanor told me. "They clearly show team attributions that don't match what he's been sending to Frankfurt. If you need them for any reason—" "I might," I acknowledged. "Thank you, Eleanor." My next call was to Martin, Ryan's business partner. He was clearly uncomfortable when he realized it was me calling, but professional courtesy prevented him from ignoring the contact. "Catherine," he began hesitantly, "I want you to know I had no idea about the extent of Ryan's personal situation until very recently." "But you knew something?" I said, not a question but a statement. Martin sighed heavily. "I knew he was pursuing international opportunities. The Frankfurt position came up about 6 months ago, but he presented it as a potential satellite office for our firm, not a complete relocation and separation from you." "When did you learn the truth?" 2 weeks ago," he admitted. "He called a partner meeting to discuss a buyout of his share in the firm. That's when he mentioned the separation plans." And none of you thought this information might be relevant to me? I kept my voice neutral, but the implication was clear. He assured us he would be discussing it with you privately before making any announcements, Martin said, his discomfort evident. We all assumed you were already aware of the general situation, if not the specific timing. If I had known otherwise, I cut him off. I need copies of the partnership agreement and any documentation regarding the proposed buyout. I'm assuming these discussions are reflected in meeting minutes. Catherine, I'm not sure I can... Martin, I interrupted, my voice taking on the edge I typically reserved for opposing counsel attempting to withhold relevant information. As Ryan's spouse, I have legitimate interest in business transactions that may affect marital assets. You can provide these documents voluntarily now, or through subpoena later. One option preserves our longtime friendship. He agreed to email everything within the hour. By late afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier: financial records showing systematic diversion of assets, professional documents revealing misrepresentation of credentials and personal communications, demonstrating the duration and extent of the deception. I had names, dates, account numbers, and property details. My phone had been buzzing consistently throughout the day, concerned friends, family members checking on my well-being, even a cautious text from Ryan asking when we might calmly discuss arrangements. I had responded to none of them, focusing entirely on gathering information rather than managing others' reactions to the situation. As evening approached, I reviewed everything I had compiled. The picture that emerged was both clearer and more disturbing than I had initially understood. Ryan hadn't simply fallen in love with someone else and made poor decisions in the emotional confusion that followed. He had orchestrated a deliberate, years-long deception that extended beyond our marriage into his professional representation, financial management, and social positioning. This wasn't just a husband leaving his wife for another woman. This was a calculated construction of an entirely separate life, brick by methodical brick, while maintaining a facade designed to maximize his advantages and minimize his accountability. I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of water, standing at the kitchen window as darkness fell. The home that had felt like a sanctuary for 15 years now seemed filled with hidden passages and false walls, an architectural illusion designed to conceal rather than reveal. Tomorrow would be about strategy and implementation, but tonight, armed with knowledge that transformed confusion into clarity, I allowed myself to feel not just the pain of betrayal, but the first stirrings of something unexpected: relief. The uncertainty was gone. The questions had answers. Even if they weren't the ones I would have chosen, I knew exactly what I was facing now. And knowledge, as any good attorney understood, was the foundation of an effective response. By the third day after my birthday revelation, I had stopped ignoring the messages flooding my phone, not to seek sympathy or share emotional updates, but to begin constructing what would come next. My first call was to Diane Levinson, the managing partner at my law firm and a woman whose own divorce 20 years earlier had become something of a legend in legal circles. She had not only survived the public dissolution of her marriage to another prominent attorney, but had emerged with her professional reputation enhanced and her personal boundaries firmly established. "I need 2 weeks," I told her after explaining the situation in concise, factual terms. "Not vacation, not sick leave. I'll maintain critical client contact remotely, and Samantha can handle the preliminary work on the Westridge merger. But I need focused time without office commitments." Diane's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Take 3 if you need it. And Catherine, use Philip Cohen for the divorce. He handles partners' personal legal matters with absolute discretion." "I'll need more than discretion," I replied. "I need someone who understands complex financial concealment and isn't afraid of professional consequences when opposing counsel has industry connections." Cohen took on the former state attorney general. "In my divorce?" Diane said with grim satisfaction. "He'll handle an architect with delusions of grandeur just fine. I'll have him call you this afternoon." My next call was to my sister Grace, who had been texting hourly updates since the birthday dinner. "I need you to stop by," I told her. "And bring your laptop." Grace arrived within the hour, arms laden with groceries despite no request for them. "You probably haven't been eating," she explained, unpacking fresh produce and prepared meals into my refrigerator. "What do you need the laptop for? Yours is better than mine anyway." "I need to create documents on a device Ryan has never accessed," I explained, "and I need you to witness some financial documentation before I move forward." Grace's expression shifted from concerned sister to focused ally. Before becoming a full-time mother to her 3 children, she had worked in corporate compliance. She understood documentation and process better than anyone else I trusted completely. Together, we created a comprehensive inventory of assets: the house, investment accounts, retirement funds, artwork, even the wine collection Ryan had meticulously cultivated over the years. Each item was photographed, valued based on recent appraisals or purchases, and categorized according to whether it had been acquired before our marriage, during our marriage using individual funds, or with joint resources. "He's going to fight you on the international accounts," Grace observed as we organized the documentation. "Those transfers were deliberate attempts to shield assets." "I'm counting on it," I replied, adding another folder to our growing digital archive. The more he tries to hide, the stronger the case for financial deception, which significantly impacts how the court will view the overall settlement. By evening, we had created a parallel record-keeping system that existed entirely outside our shared digital environment. One Ryan couldn't access, modify, or even know existed until it became legally relevant. The following day, I met with Philip Cohen in a private conference room at a hotel rather than at his office, where legal community observers might note our meeting. Cohen's reputation was well-deserved. He asked precise questions, took minimal notes, and quickly grasped both the legal and personal dimensions of the situation. "2 priorities," he said, after reviewing my compiled documentation. "First, preserving your financial position by preventing further asset movement. Second, protecting your professional reputation from any collateral damage as this becomes public. And a third," I added, "ensuring that the narrative reflects reality, that this wasn't a mutual decision or a relationship that simply evolved apart, but a calculated deception maintained over years." Cohen nodded, understanding the personal stake beyond the legal and financial considerations. "The documentation you've gathered already puts us in an exceptionally strong position. Most clients come to me emotional and unprepared. You've done half my job already." "I am emotional," I clarified. "I'm just not letting it interfere with necessary preparation." "The best kind of client," Cohen said with approval. "Now, about timing. Based on what you've shared, your husband believes he's controlling the timeline. He expects you to be processing emotional shock while he finalizes his exit strategy. This gives us a significant tactical advantage. We developed a 2-track approach. Legal proceedings would begin with formal financial disclosure requests that would reveal the discrepancies I'd already documented, while simultaneously, I would appear to be focusing on emotional recovery rather than strategic response. "Let him think you're still reeling," Cohen advised. "Every day he believes you're too distraught to take action is another day we can prepare without his awareness." The legal strategy established, I turned to the personal and professional considerations. I selected a real estate agent who specialized in discreet high-end sales to evaluate our home. After 15 years of building memories there, I had no desire to remain in a space so thoroughly infused with deception. The house had been our most significant shared asset, but now it felt more like an architectural embodiment of our marriage. Beautiful from the outside, but hiding structural flaws within. "We can list it quietly," the agent explained during her assessment. "No public open houses, only qualified private showings. Given the location and condition, I don't anticipate difficulties finding a buyer quickly, even with the premium pricing. Next came professional considerations. While Ryan had been creating his exit strategy to Frankfurt, I had been declining opportunities that would have complicated our shared life, including an offer to lead a new specialized legal division that would have required extensive travel. The position had been filled 6 months ago, but the conversation had opened doors that might still be accessible. I arranged lunch with Harriet Wilson, the firm's head of international operations, ostensibly to discuss a current case with global implications. Once we moved past case specifics, I carefully guided the conversation toward future department developments. I've been considering expanding my practice focus, I mentioned. My tone casual but purposeful. The Armendariz case demonstrated some interesting intersections between domestic and international regulatory frameworks that might be worth exploring further. Harriet studied me with the shrewd assessment that had made her a formidable presence in international legal circles. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you decline involvement in our European expansion specifically because Ryan's work kept you anchored here? Personal circumstances have changed, I replied simply. My professional decisions can now be based entirely on career considerations rather than geographic compromises. Understanding flickered across her expression. In our profession, personal information traveled quickly through carefully worded allusions rather than explicit statements. Interesting timing, she said. The Frankfurt office has been struggling to establish proper regulatory expertise. We've been considering bringing in someone from the New York team, but a talent from our home office would be preferable. She paused deliberately. The position would require significant on-site presence initially, perhaps 6 to 8 months of primary residence there. Frankfurt, the very city where Ryan was planning his new life with Claudia. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. That sounds potentially ideal, I said, maintaining professional composure while internally recognizing the exquisite irony. I'd be very interested in discussing specifics when appropriate. By the end of the week, I had established the framework for a complete life reconstruction, legal representation to handle the divorce, financial documentation to protect my interests, real estate arrangements to transition from our shared home, and professional opportunities that would transform Ryan's abandonment into my advancement. Each element had been developed without his knowledge or input, creating a parallel path forward that he could neither anticipate nor control. While he believed I was still adjusting to his announcement, I was methodically constructing a future that would not only preserve what I valued, but potentially enhance it. The architect in Ryan had designed what he thought was a perfect exit, but he had failed to consider that I had been building my own foundations for 15 years, foundations of professional respect, personal integrity, and strategic thinking that remained solid, even as our marriage crumbled. When I finally responded to his text requesting a meeting to discuss arrangements, my reply was brief and controlled. My attorney will contact yours next week to begin formal proceedings. Until then, I prefer to maintain communication in writing only. His response came immediately. Attorney, Catherine, I was hoping we could handle this amicably without involving lawyers right away. I allowed myself a small smile at his evident surprise before typing. Given the extent of undisclosed financial activity and the deliberate nature of the deception involved, legal representation seems the only prudent approach. I'm sure you understand. The 3 dots indicating his typing appeared and disappeared several times before a final message arrived. I never wanted it to be like this. And yet, I replied, you designed it precisely this way. While I was methodically rebuilding my foundation, Ryan was discovering that architectural precision doesn't always translate to life's messier realities. Through carefully cultivated professional contacts and the occasional update from well-meaning mutual friends, I began to piece together his parallel journey during these weeks. His initial confidence had apparently given way to mounting complications. Martin confided during our weekly documentation exchange that the firm's clients were responding poorly to news of Ryan's impending departure. The Westlake development has explicitly requested reassignment to another partner, Martin told me, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. Apparently, they don't appreciate learning that the architect who promised personal oversight throughout the 5-year project is leaving the country after the initial phase. Similar reactions were cascading through his professional circles. The sustainable design community that had embraced Ryan as an innovative voice was now questioning his commitment to ongoing projects. 3 speaking engagements at industry conferences had been quietly reassigned to other experts. The architectural magazine that had been planning a feature on his work had indefinitely postponed the article. He's discovering that reputation isn't just about talent, Martin observed. It's about reliability. Ryan's personal narrative was unraveling as well. Eleanor, now working as a project coordinator for a competing firm, reported that his carefully curated explanation for our separation was meeting skepticism after my birthday dinner guests shared their first-hand accounts of his announcement and my subsequent revelations. He's been telling everyone that you both had been growing apart for years and that Frankfurt just brought inevitable conclusions to the surface, Eleanor said during our lunch meeting. But Jessica and David were at your birthday dinner. They've shared quite a different perspective with several members of the industry association. Most illuminating was the update from Rebecca, my longtime friend who maintained connections with the European architectural community through her art consultancy business. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for especially juicy information. I thought you might want to know that your husband's Frankfurt paradise isn't quite as solid as he presented, she began without preamble. My contact at the Berlin Design Institute mentioned that Brenner & Koenig is undergoing significant restructuring. Apparently, they overextended on several major projects and are now consolidating operations. What kind of restructuring? I asked, professional curiosity overriding personal vindication. The kind where development directors become expendable, Rebecca replied with undisguised satisfaction. Claudia Brenner has been quietly demoted. She's still with the firm, but the grand position she presumably promised Ryan has been significantly downsized. They're keeping the International Design Division, but it's now under the direct supervision of the managing partners rather than operating as the independent unit she'd been promoting. I absorbed this information with complex emotions. On one level, there was undeniable satisfaction in learning that Ryan's carefully constructed exit strategy was facing unexpected structural weaknesses. On another, more reflective level, I recognized the pattern that had emerged throughout our marriage, Ryan pursuing grand aesthetic visions without fully assessing practical foundations. Ryan's response to these mounting complications revealed aspects of his character that I had either overlooked or excused during our marriage. Rather than adapting to changing circumstances with transparency, he doubled down on the narrative he'd created, even as evidence contradicted his claims. When clients expressed concerns about his commitment, he promised ongoing involvement through regular consultation visits that his relocation schedule couldn't possibly accommodate. When colleagues questioned the timing of his departure, he elaborated on fictitious discussions between us that had never occurred. When financial negotiations with the firm hit obstacles, he attempted to accelerate asset liquidations that my legal team had already flagged and prevented. Most telling was his approach to our divorce proceedings. After his initial surprise at my legal representation, Ryan secured his own attorney, not a family law specialist, but a corporate lawyer from his professional circle who was ill-equipped for the complexities of matrimonial dissolution. This choice reflected his persistent tendency to prioritize appearances over substance, selecting counsel based on social standing rather than relevant expertise. His first formal settlement offer arrived via his attorney 2 weeks after my birthday, offering terms so blatantly inequitable that Philip Cohen actually laughed during our review meeting. He's proposing you retain the house, which is mortgaged at 60% of its current value, while he keeps the liquid investments and retirement accounts, Cohen summarized, shaking his head. Plus, he's claiming that his recent business investments are separate property despite being funded from joint accounts during the marriage. Either he's receiving spectacularly bad legal advice, or he genuinely believes you'll accept this, out of emotional exhaustion. Both are possible, I replied, remembering similar negotiations throughout our marriage where Ryan had presented aesthetic concessions as equal to practical ones. He's always been skilled at packaging inequity in attractive wrapping. As weeks passed, Ryan's communications shifted from confident directives to increasingly urgent requests for direct conversation without the attorneys. Each message revealed growing awareness that his careful exit strategy was unraveling, though never with explicit acknowledgement of his miscalculations. "Catherine, there's no need to make this more complicated than necessary," he wrote in one particularly tone-deaf email. "We're both professionals who can surely reach reasonable accommodations without excessive legal intervention." This from the man who had planned a separate financial life for 18 months while maintaining our marriage as a convenient facade. The most revealing glimpse into Ryan's deteriorating position came through Martin, who requested a private meeting at a cafe far from both our offices. He arrived looking uncomfortable but determined, sliding a folder across the table before even ordering coffee. "Ryan doesn't know I'm showing you this," he began, tapping the folder. "Frankly, if he did, our partnership would likely end immediately. But I've known you for 15 years, and I can't stand by silently anymore." Inside was a copy of an email exchange between Ryan and Claudia from the previous week. The tone was dramatically different from the confident romantic communications I'd seen from earlier periods. Instead, it read like crisis management between increasingly disconnected partners. "The firm expects me to arrive with the expertise and client connections I promised," Ryan had written. "You assured me the development division would operate independently under your direction, with resources for the sustainability initiatives that justified this entire move." Claudia's response was coolly professional. "The economic realities have changed since our initial discussions. As I've explained repeatedly, the restructuring was beyond my control. The position still offers significant opportunities, but you'll need to adjust your expectations regarding autonomy and resource allocation." His reply revealed panic beneath professional phrasing. "I've committed to this transition. Contracts have been signed, professional bridges burned. My divorce is proceeding specifically because of the opportunities you outlined. These aren't minor adjustments you're suggesting. They fundamentally alter the basis of my decision." Her final response was perhaps the most illuminating. "I understand your frustration, but I've been transparent about developments as they've occurred. Perhaps this is an appropriate moment to distinguish between our professional and personal relationships. The firm's offer remains valid, even with the restructured parameters. Our personal connection, while important, cannot influence organizational decisions beyond my authority." Martin watched my expression as I finished reading. "From what I gather," he said quietly, "the personal relationship is cooling in direct proportion to the professional complications. Classic Claudia, according to industry gossip. She has something of a reputation for enthusiasm that wanes when practical challenges arise." I closed the folder, processing implications beyond the immediate satisfaction of seeing Ryan's plans collapse. "Thank you for showing me this," I said sincerely, "though I'm curious about your motivation." Martin considered his response carefully. "Ryan and I built this firm together, and I respected him enormously. But watching how he's handled this, the deception, the lack of professional courtesy, the willingness to discard 15 years of marriage and 13 years of partnership for an illusion that's already fading, I keep wondering if I ever really knew him." He met my gaze directly. "And frankly, the firm's survival now depends on demonstrating to clients that his actions don't reflect our professional ethics. I can't repair what he's broken in your marriage, but I can at least ensure you have complete information for whatever comes next." As Martin left, I remained at the cafe, reflecting on how thoroughly Ryan's carefully constructed image was unraveling across all domains of his life. The man who had appeared so confidently in control at my birthday dinner, so certain of his new direction, and so dismissive of what he was leaving behind, was now frantically trying to stabilize a crumbling foundation that had never been as solid as he pretended. The architect who prided himself on vision and precision had failed to properly assess structural weaknesses in his grand design. And now, as those weaknesses became increasingly apparent, his response wasn't honest reassessment, but increasingly desperate attempts to maintain a facade that no longer convinced anyone, not his colleagues, not his clients, and certainly not me. 4 weeks after my birthday dinner, the carefully constructed parallel tracks of my response converged into a precisely timed revelation that would irrevocably alter the balance of power in our divorce proceedings. The groundwork had been methodically laid, financial documentation secured, professional opportunities solidified, support networks established, and legal strategy refined. What remained was to transition from defensive protection to strategic disclosure, on my terms, not Ryan's. The catalyst arrived in the form of a settlement conference scheduled by the court. These preliminary meetings typically serve as opportunities to identify areas of potential agreement before proceeding to more formal litigation. Ryan's attorney had requested the conference, likely hoping to pressure me into accepting terms before our full financial discovery process was complete. The evening before the conference, I met with Philip Cohen for final preparation at his office. "Tomorrow changes the dynamic completely," Cohen advised, reviewing our documentation one last time. "Until now, your husband has operated under the assumption that you're responding to his actions, playing defense while he controls the narrative. Tomorrow, we reveal that you've been 10 steps ahead since the beginning. Do you anticipate resistance to the financial disclosure requests?" I asked, mentally reviewing the specific accounts we had identified through my investigation. "Significant resistance," Cohen confirmed. "Based on the correspondence so far, his counsel seems unaware of the offshore transfers and joint property inquiries with Ms. Brenner. They'll likely argue those are separate property or post-separation activities. Which is why timing matters," I noted. "The documentation clearly establishes these activities began years before any supposed separation." Cohen smiled slightly. "Precisely. And when their position becomes untenable, they'll likely request a recess to consult with their client. That's when you'll know the power has shifted." The following morning, I dressed with particular care, not in the power suit typically expected for legal proceedings, but in a dress Ryan had never seen before. The choice was deliberate. Nothing from our shared life, nothing he would recognize, or associate with the woman he thought he knew. My appearance would be the first indication that he was no longer interacting with the wife he had strategically blindsided, but with someone who had evolved beyond his manipulation. The conference room at the courthouse was clinically neutral, with the expected long table and uncomfortable chairs. Ryan arrived with his attorney, Bradley Parker, a corporate lawyer whose expertise in mergers and acquisitions translated poorly to matrimonial proceedings. Ryan himself looked less polished than usual, subtle indicators of strain visible in the slight shadows under his eyes and the less-than-perfect tailoring of his suit. His expression when he saw me contained a flash of genuine surprise. Whether at my composed appearance or the fact that I had arrived early and was already seated in the power position at the table, I couldn't be certain. Either way, it was the first small victory of the day. "Catherine," he acknowledged with a nod that attempted casual confidence but achieved neither. "Ryan," I replied simply, not offering more. The mediator, a retired judge with decades of family court experience, began the proceedings with standard introductions and ground rules. Parker opened with what he clearly believed was a generous, revised offer, one that still significantly favored Ryan, but included minor concessions on property division. "My client is primarily concerned with an expedient and amicable resolution," Parker concluded, sliding copies of their proposal across the table. These terms represent a fair division of marital assets while acknowledging both parties' contributions to the marriage. Cohen accepted the document with professional courtesy, but didn't immediately review it. Instead, he opened his own folder and distributed a significantly thicker document set to everyone at the table. Before addressing the proposed settlement terms, we need to establish an accurate foundation regarding marital assets, Cohen stated. Our financial disclosure filing includes several accounts and investments not acknowledged in Mr. Matthews's initial disclosures. He directed everyone's attention to specific pages detailing the systematic transfers Ryan had made over the past 18 months, the joint property inquiries with Claudia, and the undisclosed investment accounts established during our marriage, but omitted from Ryan's financial declarations. Additionally, Cohen continued smoothly, we've included documentation of communications between Mr. Matthews and Ms. Claudia Brenner dating back 3 years, establishing a timeline of financial and personal entanglement that directly contradicts Mr. Matthews's characterization of recent events in his settlement proposal. The mediator, experienced enough to recognize significant discrepancies when presented with them, turned her attention to Parker. Counsel, are you familiar with these accounts and communications? Parker glanced at Ryan, whose complexion had paled noticeably, before responding. Your Honor, we would need time to review these alleged documents. My client has been fully transparent about all marital assets. Transparent? I couldn't help interjecting, my voice cool but controlled. Is that how you characterize systematic financial concealment spanning 18 months? Or a 3-year relationship conducted while maintaining our marriage as a convenient facade? Ryan's expression hardened. That's not an accurate representation. It's documented in your own words, Ryan, I interrupted, pushing the communications section toward him, including your detailed discussions with Ms. Brenner about your exit strategy and how to minimize financial exposure during divorce proceedings. The mediator reviewed the materials with increasing concern. These are serious discrepancies, Mr. Parker. If accurate, they suggest intentional financial misrepresentation, which the court considers when determining equitable distribution. Parker, clearly recognizing the precarious position, requested the anticipated recess to consult with his client. As they left the room, Cohen and I exchanged the briefest glance of confirmation, exactly as predicted. When they returned 20 minutes later, the dynamic had visibly shifted. Ryan's confident facade had given way to a mixture of resignation and barely contained anger. Parker's approach had transformed from aggressive to conciliatory. My client would like to propose a brief adjournment to allow for comprehensive review of these additional documents. Parker began carefully. We believe a more productive discussion can occur once we've had proper time to assess all information. While we're amenable to rescheduling, Cohen replied, we should note that these documents have been filed with the court as part of our financial disclosure. Additionally, given the evidence of ongoing attempts to transfer marital assets, we'll be filing for temporary restraining orders preventing any further financial transactions involving joint property or assets acquired during the marriage. The remainder of the conference proceeded with technical discussions of next steps and scheduling. But the substantive battle had already been decided. Ryan's carefully constructed narrative had collapsed under the weight of documented evidence, and his attorney was now in damage control mode rather than advancing aggressive positions. As the meeting concluded, Ryan attempted to approach me directly. Catherine, we should talk privately. This doesn't need to become more adversarial than necessary. I believe adversarial was established when you planned a separate life for 3 years while maintaining our marriage under false pretenses. I replied, gathering my documents. All further communication should go through counsel. His facade cracked further, frustration bleeding through. This isn't who we are, turning 15 years into a legal battlefield. I met his gaze directly. No, Ryan, this is exactly who you are. You designed this outcome with the same precision you apply to your architectural projects. The only difference is that the structural flaws in this design became visible before completion. As I left the conference room, I felt a peculiar lightness. The strategic unveiling had accomplished exactly what Cohen and I had planned, shifting the narrative from Ryan's controlled exit to his documented deception, establishing the legal high ground for everything that would follow, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrating that I was no longer reacting to his actions, but directing my own response. The architect who had planned my public humiliation at my birthday dinner was now facing a blueprint he hadn't designed and couldn't control. His carefully constructed double life was now fully exposed not just to me, but to the legal system that would determine our futures. 3 days after the settlement conference, Ryan appeared unannounced at my office. My assistant's wide-eyed expression as she stepped into my doorway told me something unusual was happening before she even spoke. "Mr. Matthews is here," she said, emphasizing his formal name rather than "your husband," as she would have previously. "He doesn't have an appointment. Should I tell him you're unavailable?" I considered the options briefly. Eventually, a direct confrontation would be necessary, not for reconciliation, but for final clarity. The question was whether this was the optimal moment and setting. "Give me 2 minutes," I decided, "then send him in." Those 2 minutes were spent not in anxious preparation, but in deliberate centering. I closed the brief I'd been reviewing, straightened the already immaculate desk, and adjusted my position so that when Ryan entered, he would find me perfectly composed and in command of my professional space. When he walked through the door, I was struck by the visible changes in his appearance since our encounter at the settlement conference. Ryan had always maintained a certain polished aesthetic. It was part of his professional persona as much as his personal one. Now, his typically perfect haircut needed attention, his shirt showed subtle wrinkles, and the confident posture that had once seemed natural appeared deliberately maintained rather than effortless. "Catherine," he began, remaining standing even after I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "This has gone far enough. We need to talk directly, without lawyers turning this into something uglier than it needs to be." "Please close the door," I replied calmly, "if you intend to continue this conversation." He did so, then approached my desk, but still didn't sit. The power dynamic wasn't lost on me. Standing while I remained seated was a subtle attempt to reclaim authority in the interaction. "The financial disclosures your attorney presented were deliberately misleading," he said, his tone carrying the same persuasive confidence he used with reluctant clients. "Those accounts represented business investments related to international projects, not personal assets being hidden from you." I allowed a moment of silence before responding. "Business investments that happened to be jointly held with Claudia Brenner? That coincidentally began shortly after your Berlin trip 3 years ago? That were funded by transfers from our joint accounts without discussion or disclosure?" His jaw tightened. "You're creating a narrative that distorts the actual situation." "No, Ryan," I corrected him, my voice level. "I'm documenting a narrative that you created through your own actions and communications. The distinction matters." He finally sat, though perched at the edge of the chair rather than settling into it. "I made mistakes in how I handled certain aspects of this transition. I acknowledge that. But transforming poor communication into deliberate deception serves no one's interests." "Poor communication," I repeated, the phrase so inadequate it would have been laughable if not for the context. "Is that how you characterize maintaining a 3-year relationship while married? Or systematically constructing a separate financial life while presenting our marriage as intact? Or perhaps planning a public exit at my birthday celebration without any prior indication that our 15-year marriage was ending?" Ryan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized from countless professional challenges we'd weathered together. The familiarity of it struck an unexpected chord. This was the man I had built a life with, now sitting across from me as essentially a stranger. "I never intended to hurt you," he said, his voice dropping. "Things with Claudia, they developed gradually. By the time I realized the implications, everything was already in motion. I kept hoping there would be a right time, a better way, to transition that would minimize the pain for everyone involved. So you chose my 40th birthday dinner, surrounded by our closest friends and family, I observed. A truly compassionate choice. He flinched slightly. That was poorly conceived. I thought a supportive environment would be better than a private conversation that might become volatile. You mean you thought social pressure would prevent me from responding authentically to being blindsided? I corrected. You weren't protecting me from pain, Ryan. You were protecting yourself. From accountability, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or the first genuine moment of self-reflection since this conversation began. The Frankfurt position is being restructured, he said after a pause, abruptly changing direction. The development division Claudia was supposed to lead has been consolidated under the managing partners. I know, I replied simply. His eyebrows rose slightly. How could you possibly— The architectural community talks, Ryan, especially when a prominent designer abandons active projects for an international position that mysteriously changes terms before he even arrives. He absorbed this information with visible discomfort. Then you understand that the circumstances have evolved significantly since our separation. The financial terms you're demanding through your attorney no longer align with the practical realities I'm facing. And there it was, the actual purpose behind this unexpected visit. Not reconciliation, not even genuine accountability, but an attempt to renegotiate from a weakened position without formal legal proceedings. The financial terms I'm demanding are based on documented marital assets and standard equitable distribution, I noted. Your changing professional circumstances don't alter the fundamental reality of our shared property or the financial decisions you made while we were married. He leaned forward, intensity radiating from his posture. Catherine, be reasonable. If you push for everything outlined in your disclosure demands, it would essentially eliminate any possibility of a fresh start in Frankfurt. Is that really what you want? To ensure I can't move forward just because my moving forward looks different than planned? The question struck me as so profoundly revealing of his perspective that I paused to fully absorb it. Even now, facing the consequences of years of deception, Ryan's primary concern was how those consequences might impact his planned future, a future deliberately constructed without me. What I want, I said carefully, is irrelevant to the legal reality of our situation. You made specific choices over an extended period that created this outcome. The fact that the outcome is now less advantageous than you anticipated doesn't change the nature of those choices or their consequences. Frustration flashed across his features. After 15 years together, you can separate legal technicalities from the human reality so cleanly? This clinical approach isn't who you are, Catherine. You don't actually know who I am anymore, Ryan, I replied. The statement simple but profound, just as I didn't truly know you. Not the man who could maintain a double life for 3 years while coming home to me each night, discussing renovation plans and retirement savings as if our future remained shared. He fell silent. The truth of this observation apparently penetrating his carefully maintained narrative. I'm not pursuing these terms out of vengeance, I continued after a moment. I'm pursuing equitable distribution of assets that were accumulated during our marriage, many of which you attempted to shield through deliberate concealment. If that creates complications for your Frankfurt plans, those complications stem from your choices, not mine. Ryan stood abruptly, the meeting clearly not proceeding as he had hoped. I'll have Parker contact your attorney with a revised proposal, he said stiffly. Perhaps we can still find reasonable middle ground. As he reached for the door, I called his name one final time. He turned, expectation briefly visible in his expression, perhaps anticipating a softening, an opening for the manipulation that had historically been effective in our relationship. The house is being listed next week, I informed him instead. If there are any personal items you haven't yet retrieved, you should arrange to collect them before the staging photographers arrive on Tuesday. Something in his posture deflated. Slightly, the last vestige of control slipping away. The house, the physical manifestation of our shared life, was being released, another anchor cut in the systematic dismantling of what had once been us. 15 years, Catherine, he said quietly. Doesn't that count for anything in how we handle this ending? I met his gaze directly. It counted for nothing in how you planned your exit, Ryan. That was your choice, not mine. As the door closed, behind him, I realized our direct confrontation had provided something unexpected. Not vindication or emotional catharsis, but a final confirmation that the marriage I thought I had wasn't the marriage that actually existed. The man who had just left my office was not the partner I had believed in for 15 years, but someone who had been carefully curating a specific image while constructing an entirely separate reality. The clarity was, in its own way, a gift, painful, but necessary for truly moving forward. The consequences of Ryan's exposed deception and our impending divorce extended far beyond our personal relationship, creating ripple effects that touched every aspect of our intertwined lives. What had begun as his carefully orchestrated exit strategy had transformed into a cautionary tale circulating through our professional and social circles. The first significant ripple appeared in our professional communities. Architecture and law are both relationship-driven fields where reputation and reliability are paramount. The story of Ryan's double life, not just a personal indiscretion but a systematic deception spanning years, had spread through industry channels with remarkable speed. Martin called me 2 weeks after Ryan's office visit to share developments at their firm. The partners voted yesterday, he informed me, his tone carefully neutral despite the significance of what he was about to share. Ryan's being bought out at minimum contractual valuation rather than fair market value. Is that standard procedure? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not remotely, Martin admitted. It's the option reserved for partners leaving under problematic circumstances. The client retention issues gave us legitimate business justification, but frankly, the partnership was unified in wanting to distance the firm from his situation. The architectural industry's response extended beyond Ryan's firm. 2 prestigious design awards committees quietly removed him from consideration, citing professional ethics concerns in confidential communications that inevitably leaked to wider circles. A university that had been discussing a visiting lecturer position with him abruptly ceased communication after the department chair received several pointed emails from industry colleagues. My own professional reputation, somewhat to my surprise, experienced an opposite trajectory. Colleagues who might have previously maintained professional distance out of respect for difficult personal circumstances now approached me with increased respect. The way you've handled this situation speaks volumes, Harriet told me during our follow-up meeting about the Frankfurt opportunity. Maintaining professional focus while navigating what must be an emotionally challenging personal circumstance demonstrates exactly the kind of steady leadership we need for the European regulatory division. The formal offer came the following week, a 2-year assignment establishing legal compliance protocols for the firm's European operations, with Frankfurt as the primary base but authority over offices in Berlin, Paris, and Milan as well. The financial package exceeded my current compensation by nearly 40%, with housing allowance and regular home office rotations included. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would be establishing myself in Frankfurt for legitimate professional advancement, while Ryan's carefully constructed opportunity there crumbled. But the satisfaction wasn't in replacing him in the same city. It was in the recognition that my path forward had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than deception. The social ripples were equally significant, though less predictable in their patterns. The friends who had witnessed Ryan's birthday announcement and my subsequent revelations sorted themselves into distinct categories with surprising clarity. Some, like Rebecca and David, became fierce advocates, proactively excluding Ryan from social gatherings and making their loyalty unmistakable. Anyone who could orchestrate that kind of public humiliation doesn't deserve the consideration of mutual friends, Rebecca declared bluntly during our monthly dinner. Others maintained studied neutrality, uncomfortable with taking sides yet unwilling to fully embrace either narrative. These relationships drifted into polite distance, holiday cards and occasional social media interactions replacing deeper connections. A small but vocal minority aligned themselves with Ryan, either out of genuine belief in his version of events or strategic professional alignment. These were primarily his industry colleagues and a few couples where the husbands had long-standing professional relationships with him. Their strained explanations about complex situations and multiple perspectives revealed more about their own insecurities than any objective assessment of the situation. The most unexpected social development came from people who had been peripheral in our married life, but now emerged as meaningful connections in my transition. Former colleagues I hadn't seen in years reached out with genuine support. Distant acquaintances with divorce experience offered practical advice without judgment. A neighbor I'd previously exchanged nothing more than polite greetings with invited me to join her book club, creating a new social outlet unconnected to my previous life. Family dynamics shifted as well. My sister Grace, already firmly in my corner, became even more involved in my daily life, her protective instincts in full activation. My father, initially stunned by Ryan's betrayal of the son-in-law he had welcomed and respected, channeled his disappointment into practical assistance, connecting me with financial advisors specializing in post-divorce investment strategies. Most surprising was my mother's transformation. Throughout my marriage, she had maintained a traditional perspective on marital roles, occasionally suggesting I focus too much on my career at the expense of creating a family with Ryan. Now, faced with the reality of his deception, she underwent a remarkable evolution. I was wrong, she admitted during a Sunday visit, helping me sort through kitchen items for the impending move. I always thought marriage required a woman's compromise and accommodation to succeed. Watching you navigate this with such dignity has made me reconsider many things I accepted without question in my own life. The house, our most visible shared asset and the physical embodiment of our marriage, created its own ripple effects as it transitioned to market. The real estate agent had been right about quick interest. 3 days after listing, we received multiple offers above asking price. The couple whose offer we accepted specifically cited the positive energy and harmonious design elements as key factors in their decision, an ironic assessment of a space constructed during a marriage built on systematic deception. Ryan's response to the rapid sale was a text message that revealed his continuing self-centeredness. The closing timeline means I'll need to accelerate my relocation plans. Can we expedite the signing of the property transfer documents? No acknowledgement of what the house had represented in our lives. No recognition of the emotional weight of its sale. Just another logistical matter to be managed according to his revised timeline. I forwarded the message to Cohen without response, letting the legal process maintain the boundaries I'd established. Perhaps the most significant ripple effect was the one I experienced internally. A fundamental reassessment of not just my marriage, but my understanding of relationships, trust, and self-knowledge. Each revelation about Ryan's deception forced me to question my own perception. How had I missed the signs? What had I chosen not to see? Which compromises had been healthy adaptations to partnership, and which had been surrenders of essential truths? These questions had no simple answers, but asking them honestly began a process of recalibration. The woman who had believed in a 15-year partnership was gone, replaced by someone more cautious, but also more attuned to authenticity, in herself and others. Grace noticed this transformation during a quiet evening on my new apartment's balcony, 2 months after the birthday revelation. "You seem more present somehow," she observed. "Even in the midst of all this chaos, you're more fully yourself." than I've seen in years. That's the strangest part of this whole experience, I admitted. Losing what I thought was the foundation of my life has somehow made me more solid in myself. The ripples continued outward, touching relationships, communities, and internal landscapes in ways neither Ryan nor I could have anticipated when he made his calculated birthday announcement. What he had designed as a controlled demolition of our marriage had instead triggered an unpredictable cascade of consequences, many devastating for him, and some unexpectedly constructive for me. 6 months after the birthday dinner that had changed everything, I stood in my new apartment, surrounded by carefully selected possessions that represented only what I truly wanted to carry forward. The space was smaller than our house had been, but felt somehow more expansive, designed entirely according to my preferences without the compromises that had characterized our shared home. The wall of windows overlooked a city park rather than the prestigious skyline view Ryan had insisted was essential for entertaining clients. The furniture combined clean modern lines with comfortable textures rather than the stark minimalism he had preferred. Books filled shelves without concern for aesthetic arrangement, and my collection of ceramics from local artists, which Ryan had relegated to a cabinet, now held places of prominence. This physical transformation of my living space reflected a deeper internal evolution that had been occurring gradually since that pivotal April evening. The woman who had built her identity partly around being Ryan's wife, being half of a power couple, being the perfect hostess in a perfectly designed home, she no longer existed. In her place stood someone both familiar and new, like returning to a childhood home and finding it simultaneously smaller and more meaningful than remembered. "Do you miss anything about your old life?" Dr. Levine asked during our weekly session. I had begun therapy not from a place of brokenness, but from recognition that navigating such a profound transition deserved professional guidance. I considered the question carefully, my initial impulse to dismiss it giving way to more nuanced reflection. "I miss the certainty," I finally admitted. "Not the marriage itself. I now understand that wasn't what I thought it was. But the sense of knowing my path, having that fundamental question settled." Dr. Levine nodded encouragingly. "That's a common experience after long-term relationships end, even under less dramatic circumstances. The framework that organized your life expectations has dissolved. But that's also what feels most liberating," I continued, the insight crystallizing as I spoke it. "For 15 years, I made decisions within the context of our marriage. My career choices were evaluated through the lens of how they would affect our shared life. Now every decision is solely mine. Both the freedom and the responsibility of that are exhilarating." This transformation extended beyond my living space and decision-making into my professional identity. 3 weeks earlier, I had accepted the Frankfurt position, with a planned relocation in January. My law firm had responded to my resignation with an unprecedented counteroffer, but the path forward felt clear in a way professional decisions rarely had before. "I'm not leaving because of what happened with Ryan," I explained to Diane during our exit discussion. "I'm leaving because this opportunity aligns perfectly with where I want to take my practice, without the constraints of balancing against someone else's career trajectory." She had studied me with characteristic directness before nodding. "You know, when this all began, many of us worried about how you would recover from such a public betrayal. None of us anticipated you would emerge stronger for it." "Neither did I acknowledged. "Neither did Ryan. The most profound aspect of my transformation had been in my relationships, not just with others, but with myself. The systematic deception I had discovered had initially shaken my confidence in my own judgment. How could I have missed the signs? How could I have believed so completely in a partnership that was partially illusory? But as weeks passed, this self-doubt gradually transformed into something more constructive, a recalibration of how I assessed authenticity in relationships. I became more attuned to the subtle discrepancies between words and actions, more willing to acknowledge uncomfortable intuitions rather than rationalizing them away. "You've stopped apologizing for taking up space," Grace observed during a weekend visit, watching me rearrange furniture until it perfectly suited my preference, without concern for traditional design rules or others' potential judgments. "I spent 15 years unconsciously accommodating someone else's vision," I replied. "Not just in furniture arrangement, but in fundamental ways I'm only now recognizing." This wasn't to say the transformation had been without challenges or setbacks. There were still mornings when I woke reaching for someone who wasn't there. Evenings when the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Moments when a future without the partnership I had believed in stretched before me with intimidating uncertainty. "Those moments don't negate your progress," Dr. Levine assured me when I shared these experiences. "They're part of the integration process, acknowledging what's been lost while continuing to build what comes next." Ryan's trajectory during this period provided a stark contrast to my own evolution. Updates came through legal channels and mutual connections rather than direct contact, creating a peculiar distance from someone who had once been my most intimate relation. The Frankfurt position had materialized, but in dramatically reduced form. A consulting role rather than the leadership position originally promised, with compensation significantly lower than projected. His professional reputation, once his most valued asset, had sustained damage that no carefully crafted narrative could fully repair. "He's telling anyone who will listen that the situation has been grossly misrepresented," Martin reported during one of our infrequent but cordial meetings. "But the architectural community has seen the documentation. They've drawn their own conclusions." Rather than vindication, this information brought a complicated mixture of emotions, a certain professional satisfaction that truth had prevailed, but also a lingering sadness for the man I had once loved and the potential he had compromised through his choices. The divorce proceedings moved toward their inevitable conclusion with surprising efficiency once the financial disclosures had been completely addressed. Ryan's attempts to shield assets had ultimately backfired, resulting in less favorable terms than would have been reached through honest negotiation. The final settlement accomplished what I had wanted from the beginning: equitable distribution that acknowledged the contributions of both partners throughout the marriage. "Most clients feel either triumphant or devastated at this stage," Cohen observed as we reviewed the final documents. "You seem contemplative." "I'm thinking about the irony," I explained. Ryan orchestrated this elaborate exit strategy to maximize his advantages in our separation. If he had simply approached me honestly about the relationship ending, we likely would have negotiated a straightforward division that could have been completed months ago, with far less damage to his professional standing. "The architecture of deception rarely proves as sound as its designer anticipates," Cohen noted with unexpected poetic insight. As the legal proceedings concluded, I found myself deliberately creating space for reflection on what my marriage had truly been, not just the deception of its final years, but the genuine connection that had existed before. There had been real love, real partnership, real shared dreams, even if their foundation had ultimately proved insufficient. This recognition didn't excuse Ryan's choices or diminish the significance of his betrayal, but it allowed me to acknowledge that the 15 years hadn't been entirely fictional, just incompletely understood from my perspective. Perhaps the most profound aspect of my transformation was the reclamation of my own narrative. Ryan's birthday. Announcement had been an attempt to control the story of our marriage's end, to position himself as the reasonable partner making a difficult but necessary transition. My subsequent discoveries and actions had wrested that narrative control away, revealing the actual story rather than the one he had carefully constructed. Now, standing in my new space surrounded by objects chosen solely because they held meaning. For me, I recognized that I was writing an entirely new story, one without predetermined architectural plans or external expectations. The blueprint was mine alone to create, the foundation stronger for having been tested, the structure designed to accommodate growth rather than maintain appearances. The woman who had been blindsided at her birthday dinner 6 months earlier no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had faced devastating betrayal and emerged not just surviving, but evolving. Someone who understood that what had initially seemed like an ending was actually a beginning disguised by pain. 1 year after the birthday dinner that had revealed Ryan's elaborate deception, I found myself once again in a restaurant surrounded by friends and family. The setting, however, could not have been more different. Instead of the formal dining room at our regular establishment where Ryan had orchestrated my public humiliation, this celebration took place at a vibrant bistro I had discovered during my post-separation exploration of the city. Rather than the carefully curated guest list Ryan had assembled as witnesses to his calculated exit, these attendees represented the authentic connections that had sustained me through transformation. Grace and her husband occupied the center of the table, their children periodically darting over from the restaurant's play area. My parents sat nearby, their dynamic subtly altered since my mother's philosophical evolution regarding marriage. Rebecca and David anchored the other end of the table with several colleagues who had become friends during the past year. Even Eleanor was there, now thriving in her new position and completely free from any lingering professional connection to Ryan. The occasion was double, ostensibly my 41st birthday, but also a farewell gathering before my departure for Frankfurt the following week. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone present, the completion of a full circle from devastating revelation to empowered new beginning. "I'd like to propose a toast," Grace announced, rising from her seat with champagne flute in hand. "To my sister, who taught us all something about resilience this year. When life handed her an architect's flawed blueprints, she demolished the structure and built something far more beautiful in its place." Glasses clinked amid warm laughter and murmurs of agreement. The metaphors had become something of an inside joke among those closest to me. Architectural references that transformed painful history into statements of empowerment. As conversations flowed around me, I found myself in a moment of quiet reflection, taking in the scene with a sense of peaceful completion that would have seemed impossible 12 months earlier. The contrast between this gathering and last year's birthday struck me not just in setting and personnel, but in the fundamental emotional landscape. Then, I had been living in a reality partially constructed of illusions, believing in a partnership that existed more in appearance than substance. Now, every relationship at this table was founded on demonstrated authenticity, connections that had withstood the stress test of crisis and emerged stronger. My phone vibrated with an incoming message. Though I typically ignored notifications during social gatherings, something prompted me to glance at the screen. The name displayed there sent an unexpected flutter through me. Ryan. In the month since our divorce had finalized, communication between us had been minimal and entirely practical. Final document signatures, tax coordination, the occasional logistical matter regarding possessions discovered during packing. This was the first contact that coincided with a significant date. The message was brief. "I know what today represents. I'm sorry for how things happened a year ago. I hope today brings better memories. No attempt at reconciliation, no thinly veiled self-justification, no request for response. Just an acknowledgement and what appeared to be genuine, if belated, regret." I slipped the phone back into my bag without replying, neither rejecting the sentiment nor engaging with it. The Ryan who had crafted that message was no longer central to my narrative, not as husband, not as betrayer, not even as antagonist. He had become a character in my past rather than an active presence in my present. "Everything okay?" Grace asked, noticing my momentary distraction. "Perfect," I replied with complete honesty. "Just a reminder of how far I've come." The evening continued with the natural ebb and flow of celebration, stories shared, plans discussed, connections reinforced. When the inevitable questions about Frankfurt arose, I spoke of the opportunity with genuine enthusiasm untainted by comparison to what might have been Ryan's parallel life there. The regulatory framework for architectural sustainability compliance is evolving rapidly in the EU. I explained to those interested in the professional aspects. Building the legal team from the ground up means establishing protocols that could influence international standards for years. And the apartment? My mother asked, her concerns still partly domestic despite her philosophical evolution. Is it comfortable? In a safe area? It's perfect, I assured her, sharing photos of the light-filled space overlooking one of the city's historic squares. Completely different from what I would have chosen a year ago, but exactly right for who I am now. What I didn't articulate, though I suspected many present understood implicitly, was that the apartment represented more than just accommodation in a foreign city. It symbolized a life designed entirely according to my own specifications, not in reaction to Ryan's betrayal, not as rejection of our shared past, but as authentic expression of my evolving self. As the evening drew to a close, David raised an observation that captured the essence of the year's journey. "You know what strikes me most?" he said, his tone thoughtful rather than celebratory. "A year ago, we were all in shock, watching a marriage implode in the most public way possible. None of us could have predicted that moment would lead to this." He gestured around the table. "Not just survival, but genuine flourishing." Rebecca nodded in agreement. When he made that announcement, he thought he was writing the ending. Turns out he was just setting up your beginning. As I looked around at the faces of those who had witnessed both the devastation and the rebuilding, I felt a profound sense of completion. The architectural metaphor that had framed so much of the past year's narrative seemed suddenly perfect in its application. Ryan had indeed been an architect, not just of buildings, but of an elaborate deception constructed over years. What he had failed to account for in his precise planning was that I was not merely an occupant of the structure he had designed, but a builder in my own right. When his careful construction collapsed under the weight of revealed truth, I had not remained buried in the rubble. Instead, I had sorted through the fragments, salvaging what remained valuable, discarding what had proven false, and using the cleared ground to create something entirely new, a life designed not for appearance or accommodation, but for authentic strength and genuine possibility. The woman who had stood shocked and humiliated in last year's birthday gathering no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had not just survived betrayal, but had transformed it into the foundation for something far stronger than what had been lost. As we gathered for a final group photo, arms linked and faces bright with genuine connection, I realized we were capturing not just a birthday celebration or a farewell gathering, but the visual evidence of complete reconstruction, a life rebuilt from the ground up, stronger at the broken places, and designed to weather whatever storms might come next. My first 3 months in Frankfurt unfolded with the particular intensity that comes from complete immersion in a new environment. The regulatory division I had been hired to establish required both technical expertise and diplomatic finesse, building relationships with architectural firms across Europe while creating compliance frameworks that would shape industry practices for years to come. The irony of my professional focus wasn't lost on me. I was literally establishing boundaries and ethical guidelines for the same industry where Ryan had operated with such calculated deception. Each policy I drafted, each compliance structure I implemented, felt like creating safeguards against the very type of misrepresentation he had perfected, both professionally and personally. What I hadn't anticipated was how my personal story would begin to influence others beyond my immediate circle. It started subtly, with colleagues seeking private conversations about their own relationship concerns after hearing fragments of my experience through professional networks. "I've been ignoring inconsistencies for months," confided Marisa, a brilliant environmental compliance attorney from our Milan office. "Telling myself I'm too busy to investigate further, too invested to risk what we've built." but hearing about your experience, I realized delaying the truth doesn't protect me from it. Similar conversations emerged with increasing frequency, not because I shared my story freely, but because others somehow sensed I would understand their uncertainty, their suspicions, their hesitation to trust instincts that contradicted comfortable narratives. More surprising were the connections that formed with other women in the architectural and legal communities who had experienced similar betrayals. A quiet network developed, not of bitter victims sharing grievances, but of professionals supporting each other through transitions that threatened both personal stability and professional standing. You demonstrated that recovery isn't just possible. It's transformative, explained Johanna, a Swedish architect who had discovered her partner's double life 6 months after my own revelation. Watching you rebuild professionally while navigating personal devastation gave me a blueprint when I needed it most. This metaphorical blueprint began taking more concrete form when Harriet suggested I develop a formal mentorship program within our firm for professionals navigating significant personal transitions. What began as informal lunch discussions evolved into structured workshops addressing practical challenges, maintaining professional focus during emotional turmoil, reestablishing financial independence, rebuilding networks when social circles fracture along relationship lines. The personal and professional are interconnected, whether we acknowledge it or not, I explained during the program's launch. Pretending otherwise doesn't serve our colleagues or our practice. Supporting each other through major life transitions isn't just compassionate, it's good business. The initiative attracted attention beyond our firm, leading to speaking invitations at industry conferences and eventually a feature in an international legal journal focusing on workplace culture. The article specifically highlighted how transforming personal adversity into professional advancement created ripple effects throughout organizations. Matthews doesn't position herself as a relationship expert or life coach, the journalist wrote. Rather, she represents something more valuable: empirical evidence that betrayal needn't define one's trajectory, that calculated humiliation can become the catalyst for authentic reconstruction. This broader impact extended into unexpected domains, including academia. A professor of ethics at Frankfurt's Business School invited me to participate in a panel discussion examining how personal ethics translate to professional conduct. The student response led to a recurring guest lecturer position, addressing how seemingly private deceptions inevitably affect professional communities. Perhaps most meaningful was the influence my journey had on individual choices that I only learned about through third parties or delayed confidences. The woman who found courage to investigate financial discrepancies in her marriage after hearing my story. The junior attorney who declined a prestigious position that would have required compromising his ethics. The architectural firm that implemented transparency requirements for international projects after witnessing the consequences of Ryan's compartmentalized deceptions. None of this broader impact had been planned or anticipated. I hadn't set out to become an emblem of resilience or an advocate for transparent boundaries between personal and professional ethics. These roles emerged organically from the authentic navigation of my own experience, from choosing reconstruction over resentment, strategic action over passive victimhood. The betrayal Ryan had choreographed as my ending had instead generated ripples of positive transformation that extended far beyond our marriage, beyond our social circle, beyond even my own professional community. The architectural precision he had applied to constructing his deception had ultimately created not just his own downfall, but the foundation for something he could never have designed: a network of strengthened boundaries, authentic connections, and ethical recommitments that continued expanding long after our shared story had concluded. 2 years to the day after Ryan's birthday announcement, I found myself standing on the balcony of my Frankfurt apartment, watching the city lights emerge. As dusk settled over the historic square below, the evening air carried the first hints of spring, a fitting metaphor for the season of life I now inhabited. Earlier that day, I had received notification that our regulatory compliance framework had been formally adopted by the European Architectural Association as their recommended standard, a professional achievement that represented months of intensive work and diplomatic negotiation. My team had celebrated with champagne and genuine camaraderie, relationships built on mutual respect rather than strategic positioning. As congratulatory messages accumulated on my phone, one particular name appeared on the screen: Ryan. We had maintained minimal contact since the divorce, primarily through attorneys or mutual connections when absolutely necessary. His message was brief and surprisingly gracious. Heard about the EAA adoption. Congratulations on creating something that will genuinely improve the industry. Well deserved. I found myself able to read his words without the emotional turbulence that would have accompanied them months earlier. There was no lingering anger, no vindictive satisfaction, no wounded pride, just the calm recognition of communication from someone who had once been central to my life, but now occupied a place in my history rather than my present. This emotional evolution represented perhaps the most profound insight of my 2-year journey. Betrayal's power diminishes not through forgetting or forgiveness, but through growth that transforms its significance in your life's narrative. The pain Ryan's deception had caused was not erased. That would be neither possible nor desirable, as it had become an essential catalyst for necessary change. But that pain no longer defined my daily experience or directed my decisions. It had been integrated into my understanding, rather than dominating my perspective. When I thought back to that birthday dinner now, I could see it clearly for what it had been. Not just the revelation of a husband's betrayal, but the exposure of fundamental imbalances that had existed throughout our marriage. Ryan's birthday announcement hadn't created the problems in our relationship. It had merely revealed the fiction we had been living, a partnership that prioritized appearance over substance, accommodation over authenticity. The woman who had stood shocked at that dinner table would never have believed that 2 years later, she would feel genuine gratitude for the painful awakening that forced her to confront uncomfortable truths. Not gratitude for the betrayal itself, but for the clarity and subsequent growth it ultimately triggered. From the perspective of time and distance, I could now recognize patterns that had been invisible while I was immersed in them. How consistently I had adjusted my preferences to accommodate Ryan's vision. How routinely I had rationalized discrepancies rather than investigating them. How completely I had accepted a narrative of partnership that wasn't fully reflected in reality. These recognitions weren't exercises in self-blame, but in self-knowledge. Essential understanding that informed how I now constructed my life and relationships with clearer boundaries and more authentic expression. The professional success I'd found in Frankfurt wasn't a reaction to Ryan's betrayal, but a manifestation of capabilities that had always existed, but had been partially constrained by the compromises our marriage required. The new relationships I'd formed weren't replacements for what was lost, but expressions of connections based on who I had become, rather than who I had been expected to be. As the lights of Frankfurt created their reflection in the main river below, I considered how thoroughly my understanding of security had transformed. What once seemed most secure, a 15-year marriage, a carefully constructed home, a shared future planned with architectural precision, had proved fundamentally unstable because it was partially built on illusion. True security, I had discovered, comes not from external structures, but from internal foundations. Self-knowledge that withstands revelation, values that survive betrayal, capabilities that transcend relationships, and the certainty that you can reconstruct your life even when what you believe to be most solid crumbles beneath you. The betrayal that Ryan had choreographed as my humiliation had instead become my liberation. The public ending he had designed to control the narrative had instead been the opening chapter of a story far more authentic and empowering than the one we had co-authored. Perhaps that was the ultimate irony and the most profound insight of this unexpected journey. Sometimes what appears to be devastating architectural failure, the collapse of structures you believed would last a lifetime, is actually the necessary clearing of ground for something far more beautiful and stable to be built. Not everyone who experiences betrayal will find the same path forward. Each journey through deception's aftermath follows its own unique blueprint, but the fundamental truth remains consistent. When someone else's choices shatter the life you thought you were building, you alone hold the power to determine what rises from those fragments. The architect of deception may control the moment of revelation, but they cannot dictate the restoration that follows. That design, that future, belongs solely to the one willing to sort through painful truths and use them as foundation stones for something entirely new and genuinely their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.